On a storm-lashed Tuesday night, Caleb Monroe discovered two strangers collapsed outside his garage, a battered woman and a silent boy who clutched her hand like a lifeline. No identification, no explanation, just terror etched in their eyes. He intended to help for one night, maybe two. But their arrival would shatter his carefully guarded world and reveal a truth that could either save them all or destroy everything he'd fought to protect. Caleb Monroe had learned to measure his days in small victories and smaller defeats. At 39, he carried the weight of widowhood like a second skin, moving through his world with the careful precision of a man who had already lost everything that mattered most. His wife Sarah had died in a house fire 3 years ago, a blaze he couldn't reach in time, despite all his training as a volunteer firefighter. The flames had taken her while he was 3 miles away, responding to a different emergency, trusting that their neighborhood was safe because fires always happened to other people in other places. Now he lived in the space between memory and survival, raising his 8-year-old daughter Josie in a converted apartment above Monroe's auto repair, the garage that barely kept them afloat financially, but provided the isolation he craved emotionally. The building had been Sarah's idea. Originally, she'd seen potential in the abandoned service station on the edge of town, had drawn up plans for renovating the upper floor into a cozy family home. After her death, Caleb had completed the project, not out of hope, but out of stubborn determination to honor her vision, even as every corner of their living space reminded him of conversations they would never finish and dreams they would never share. The night shift suited him perfectly. While Josie slept safely upstairs, protected by multiple locks and a security system that he checked obsessively, he could lose himself in the honest work of fixing what was broken, finding solace in problems that had solutions. His hands, scarred from years of rescue work and now stained permanently with motor oil, moved with practiced efficiency across engines and transmissions. These machines didn't judge him for the times he woke screaming from dreams of smoke and flames, didn't ask why he no longer volunteered for the fire department, didn't wonder why he kept everyone at arm's length. Loneliness had become his most faithful companion, as reliable as sunrise and just as inevitable. Josie tried valiantly to fill the silence with her endless chatter about school friends and playground adventures, but Caleb could see the questions forming in her bright blue eyes, questions about why Daddy never smiled anymore, why they never visited Mommy's grave together, why he flinched whenever she hugged him too suddenly or laughed too loudly. He loved her with a fierce desperation that sometimes frightened him in its intensity, but he had built walls so high around his heart that even his own daughter couldn't fully climb them. The isolation served a purpose beyond mere self-protection. Caleb had convinced himself that emotional distance was a form of insurance policy. If he didn't allow himself to care too deeply about anything or anyone beyond Josie, then loss couldn't destroy him again. He kept his interactions with customers brief and professional, declined invitations to neighborhood barbecues and school functions, and maintained the kind of polite but distant relationships that prevented anyone from getting close enough to matter. It was a strategy that had worked for 3 years, keeping his small family safe in their bubble of careful routine and controlled expectations. The woman he found that night challenged everything he thought he knew about safety and distance. She was beautiful despite the bruises that painted her face in shades of purple and yellow, her long dark hair matted with rain and something that might have been blood. Her clothes were expensive, he could tell, even in their torn and muddied state designer fabric and careful tailoring that spoke of wealth and privilege. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold when she briefly regained consciousness. They held a depth of terror that reminded him of his own reflection in those first months after Sarah's death, the look of someone who had seen their world collapse and couldn't quite believe they had survived the destruction. The boy, Max, clung to her unconscious form with the desperate grip of someone who had already lost too much. His wide green eyes tracked every movement Caleb made, flinching at sudden sounds, ready to run or fight despite his small size and obvious exhaustion. There was something hauntingly familiar about that look, the same expression Josie had worn in the weeks after her mother's funeral, when she would wake up screaming and search every room to make sure Daddy was still there, that he hadn't disappeared into smoke and flames like Mommy had. The child's clothes told a story similar to his mother's, expensive but practical, designed for a life of privilege, but now bearing the signs of rough travel and desperate circumstances. His shoes were high-end sneakers that had probably cost more than Caleb made in a week, but they were worn thin from walking, mud-caked and torn. The boy carried a small backpack that he clutched protectively, never letting it out of reach, and Caleb caught glimpses of what looked like important papers wrapped in plastic bags. Caleb's first instinct was to call the police, a response drilled into him from years of emergency training and civic responsibility. But something held him back as he studied the pair more carefully. Maybe it was the way Max had positioned himself protectively over the woman, or the expensive medical bandaging he glimpsed beneath her torn sleeve, too professional and recent for a typical domestic violence situation. Maybe it was his own hard-earned distrust of systems that promised help but often delivered more pain, bureaucracy, that could separate families and create more trauma than it prevented. Or maybe it was simply that he recognized the look of people who had nowhere else to go and no one else to trust. He carried the woman to the small couch in his office while Max shadowed his every step, never more than an arm's length away from her side. Her pulse was steady, her breathing regular exhaustion more than serious injury. He decided with his old EMT training automatically kicking in. The boy accepted a blanket and a glass of milk but never spoke, just watched with those two old eyes that had seen far more than any 6-year-old should ever witness. When Caleb offered food, Max carefully tested everything first, a behavior that suggested experience with people who might try to drug or poison him. That first night, Caleb sat in his desk chair, listening to their breathing settle into the rhythm of exhausted sleep, and wondered what he had invited into his carefully controlled world. He had spent 3 years building a life where nothing unexpected could touch them, where routine and isolation kept both him and Josie safe from the kind of loss that could destroy what remained of their small family. Now these strangers slept in his office, and he found himself remembering what it felt like to need something more than mere survival, to have a purpose beyond simply getting through each day without falling apart. Morning light streaming through the garage windows revealed more questions than answers. The woman, who still hadn't given her name or offered any explanation for their presence, moved through his space with unconscious grace, tidying areas that hadn't been clean in months. She found ingredients in his sparse kitchen that he had forgotten he owned, creating a breakfast that filled the air with warmth and the kind of domestic comfort he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. Her hands, though bearing the telltale signs of recent trauma and medical treatment, worked with the confidence of someone accustomed to taking care of others, to managing complex situations with efficiency and grace. Max remained silent throughout the morning, but Caleb watched him watching Josie with a mixture of longing and wariness that broke his heart. His daughter, bless her resilient and generous heart, seemed determined to coax the boy out of his shell, sharing her cereal and chattering about her favorite cartoons with the easy acceptance that children possessed before the world taught them to be afraid of differences. Yet Max's responses were always delayed, as if he was translating every interaction through a filter of fear and suspicion, checking each gesture and word for potential threats. The expensive shoes gave Caleb pause as he observed them more carefully in daylight Italian leather, he thought, though scuffed and torn from hard travel. The woman's movements spoke of education and privilege, the way she held herself despite her obvious exhaustion, suggesting someone accustomed to authority and responsibility. But it was the small details that truly unsettled him. The way she automatically checked the locks on all the doors, how she positioned herself to maintain visual contact with every entrance, the almost professional way she assessed his garage for potential escape routes and defensive positions. There were other signs that didn't fit the profile of typical domestic violence victims. The woman's injuries, while extensive, showed signs of professional medical treatment, proper suturing, high-quality bandages, medication that required prescriptions. Her hands were soft despite their current condition, speaking of a life that hadn't involved manual labor until recently. And Max, despite his fear and silence, displayed the kind of sophisticated vocabulary and careful manners that suggested expensive private education and a privileged upbringing. On the second night, Caleb found Max huddled under the desk in his office, trembling at the sound of distant sirens from an ambulance racing down the main highway. The boy's panic was absolute and primal, his small body shaking as if the sound itself could physically harm him. It took 20 minutes of gentle coaxing before Max would emerge from his hiding place, and even then he remained pressed against the wall, eyes darting toward the windows as if expecting pursuers to appear at any moment. The terror was too specific, too practiced. This wasn't a child's general fear of loud noises, but someone who had learned to associate sirens with immediate danger. The woman, Elena, she finally whispered when Caleb brought Max a warm cup of cocoa and sat patiently beside them, moved to comfort the boy with practiced ease. Her voice, when she finally spoke, carried the refined accent of East Coast privilege, but underneath lay something harder, more desperate. She sang softly to Max in what sounded like a lullaby, but Caleb caught fragments that chilled him. Something about helicopters and needles, about men in white coats who made people disappear, about staying quiet and staying hidden until the danger passed. Sleep eluded Caleb that night as his mind raced through possibilities and implications. He found himself researching missing persons reports on his ancient computer, though he wasn't sure what exactly he was looking for. The woman was clearly educated, probably wealthy based on the remnants of her clothing and her unconscious bearing, and the boy showed signs of trauma that went far beyond typical domestic abuse. But it was Max's whispered words from the night before that haunted him most. "I don't want to go on the helicopter anymore. I'm scared they'll give Mommy more shots." His old contacts from the fire department proved useful in ways he hadn't expected. Danny Rodriguez, now working dispatch for the county sheriff's office, owed him more than one favor from their volunteer days when Caleb had pulled him from a burning warehouse. A casual conversation about missing persons and recent cases led to information that made Caleb's blood run cold. Elena Ward, wife of recently deceased oil heir Marcus Ward, had been officially declared dead in a helicopter crash in Texas 3 months ago, along with her 6-year-old son Maxwell. Yet here they sat in his garage, very much alive and very much terrified. The official report spoke of mechanical failure, of wreckage scattered across remote ranchland, of bodies too damaged by fire to recover intact remains. The investigation had been brief and conclusive, handled by federal authorities with assistance from Ward Industries' own security team. But if Elena and Max had died in that crash, then who were the people sleeping in his office? And why was someone so determined to convince the world they were dead? The pieces began forming a picture that terrified him more than any fire he had ever fought. Marcus Ward's death 6 months earlier had been ruled accidental, a diving incident off the coast of Florida, though rumors in financial circles suggested the young heir had been investigating irregularities in his family's oil empire. Elena's subsequent hospitalization for grief-induced psychological trauma had been brief and private, handled by the family's personal physicians at an exclusive facility. And now, according to official records, both she and her son had perished in what was being called a tragic accident. But accidents, Caleb knew from his years fighting fires and responding to emergencies, rarely came in such convenient timing. Someone wanted Elena and Max Ward dead, and they wanted the world to believe they had succeeded. The question that kept him awake, staring at the ceiling and listening for any sound that might indicate danger, was whether helping them would save their lives or seal all their fates. Elena's confession came on the third night, delivered in whispered urgency while Max finally slept peacefully beside an exhausted Josie. The truth was more complex and dangerous than Caleb had imagined, a story of corporate conspiracy and murder that reached into the highest levels of American business and politics. She wasn't just the grieving widow of an oil heir, she had been the operational mind behind Ward Industries' day-to-day management, the MIT-educated engineer who had discovered the massive money laundering scheme running through their offshore drilling platforms and international subsidiaries. Marcus hadn't died in a diving accident, Elena revealed with quiet desperation. He had been murdered the day before he planned to expose his own family's criminal enterprise to federal investigators. The diving trip had been suggested by his uncle Richard, who had arranged for faulty equipment and a remote location where accidents could happen without witnesses. Elena's hospitalization hadn't been for grief, it had been a sophisticated imprisonment, drugs administered to keep her compliant, while the board of directors arranged for her permanent disappearance and the transfer of Max's inheritance to more manageable hands. The helicopter crash had been their final solution, a way to eliminate both Elena and Max while claiming the inheritance through Marcus's uncle, who was already positioned to take control of the company. Elena's escape had been possible only through the help of a psychiatric nurse named Maria Santos, who recognized the signs of forced medication and illegal detention. Together, they had staged Elena's death during a planned transport, using a combination of Elena's inside knowledge of corporate security and Maria's access to medical records to falsify the crash reports. For 3 months, they had lived as ghosts, staying ahead of private investigators and corporate security while Elena gathered evidence of the conspiracy that had destroyed her family. She had hidden copies of financial records, communication logs, and documented proof of the money laundering operation in safe deposit boxes across multiple states. But Maria had been caught 2 weeks ago, arrested on fabricated charges that would keep her silenced in federal prison, and Elena knew it was only a matter of time before their location was discovered. Caleb listened to her story with the growing certainty that his quiet life was about to explode in ways he couldn't control or prevent. He had already lost one family to circumstances beyond his control. Now he faced the choice of risking what remained for people he barely knew but had come to care about. But as he watched Max sleep peacefully for the first time since arriving, and saw the hope flickering in Elena's eyes as she spoke of justice for her murdered husband, he realized that some choices made themselves. The decision became inevitable when the first corporate hunter arrived at his garage the next morning, disguised as a customer needing transmission work. The man was professional, polite, and utterly terrifying in his casual assessment of the garage's layout and security measures. He paid for a service he didn't need with crisp $100 bills, asked detailed questions about Caleb's family and business history, and left behind a business card made of gold-plated metal, bearing only an oil derrick symbol and a phone number that Caleb was certain led nowhere safe. That afternoon, a second visitor arrived, a woman in an expensive suit who claimed to be conducting a survey about local businesses for the Chamber of Commerce. She photographed the garage extensively, noted the location of all entrances and exits, and displayed the kind of tactical awareness that suggested military or law enforcement training. When she left, Caleb found a small electronic device attached to the underside of his desk, a listening device so sophisticated that he almost missed it despite his paranoid searching. That night, his world shifted from sanctuary to battleground, the illusion of safety he had built around his family crumbling with terrifying speed. The attack came with surgical precision, designed to send a message rather than inflict immediate harm. Caleb discovered the break-in when his ancient security cameras showed footage of someone moving through his garage with night vision equipment, searching methodically through his files and computer system. His laptop had been compromised, every email and search history copied, his financial records downloaded and analyzed. They had been thorough and professional, leaving no obvious signs of disturbance but making sure he would know they had been there. But the real message arrived on Elena's phone at exactly midnight, a text containing a single photograph of Josie walking out of school, followed by coordinates and a simple ultimatum: game over. Bring the boy to these coordinates by midnight tomorrow, or Josie won't make it home from school next week. We know where she goes, who her friends are, what route she takes home. End this now. The rage that consumed Caleb was unlike anything he had experienced since Sarah's death, a fury so pure and consuming that it temporarily burned away his fear and grief. These people had crossed the one line he had thought was sacred, had turned his daughter into a target, had violated the one boundary he had never expected anyone to cross. Elena found him in his office, hands shaking as he stared at the photograph, and for the first time since her arrival, she saw the firefighter he had once been, the man who ran toward danger when everyone else ran away. Elena knelt beside his chair, her voice steady despite the terror in her own eyes. I won't let them hurt Josie because of us. We'll leave tonight, right now. You'll never see us again, and they'll have no reason to threaten your daughter. But Caleb was already moving beyond fear into the cold calculation that had once made him effective in emergency situations. No, he said quietly, his voice carrying the same deadly calm he had used to coordinate rescues in burning buildings. We end this. Tonight. The plan began forming with the kind of desperate clarity that came from having nothing left to lose and everything to protect. Elena's knowledge of Ward Industries' security protocols, combined with Caleb's understanding of tactical thinking from his firefighting days, created possibilities that neither could have achieved alone. They would give the corporation exactly what they wanted: a public transfer of Max Ward to his legal guardians, but they would do it in a way that exposed the entire conspiracy to the light of media attention and federal investigation. Elena's revelation came as they planned their counterattack, delivered with the quiet intensity of a confession that had been carried too long. Caleb, she said, studying his face in the dim light of the garage office, I know you. You probably don't remember it was 8 years ago, the oil platform explosion off the Alaska coast. I was there as part of an inspection team when the rig caught fire. The memory hit him like cold water, sudden and overwhelming. Alaska, his last major deployment with the volunteer firefighting unit before Sarah's death. The offshore platform engulfed in flames, workers trapped in the superstructure as the ocean burned around them in an apocalyptic vision of industrial disaster. He had gone in with the helicopter rescue team, rappelling through smoke and heat that should have killed anyone who ventured into its embrace, searching for survivors in a maze of twisted metal and chemical fire. There had been a woman, an executive from the oil company, trapped in an office as the metal around her began to buckle and melt. He had found her unconscious from smoke inhalation, her expensive suit singed and her face streaked with soot and tears. The evacuation had been desperate and dangerous, carrying her through corridors that were collapsing around them while the platform's structure groaned and shifted beneath their feet. "You carried me out," Elena continued, her voice breaking slightly with emotion, "through fire that should have killed us both. You told me to keep my eyes closed and trust you, that you wouldn't let the flames take me. I never forgot your voice, or the way you stayed calm when everything was falling apart around us." Caleb stared at her, seeing past the bruises and fear to the face he had glimpsed only briefly 8 years ago, streaked with soot and tears as he had carried her to the evacuation helicopter. "Elena Ward," he whispered, the pieces finally clicking into place with devastating clarity. "You were Ward Industries' safety inspector. You were there trying to prevent accidents like that one. And now I'm trying to prevent crimes much worse than accidents," she replied with quiet determination. "You saved me from fire once. I'm trusting you to save me from something much more dangerous, the people who are supposed to protect us." The weight of destiny settled around them like a familiar burden, the sense that their meeting had been inevitable rather than random. Caleb had spent 3 years running from his role as a rescuer, convinced that his failure to save Sarah meant he was no longer worthy of saving anyone. But here was Elena, offering him not just redemption, but the chance to protect not only his own daughter, but a boy who had become like a son to him in just a few short days. The confrontation would happen on their terms, in front of cameras and witnesses, with enough evidence to ensure that Ward Industries' conspiracy could never be buried again. It was dangerous, probably desperate, and absolutely their only chance of survival. But it was also the kind of challenge that reminded Caleb why he had become a firefighter in the first place, because sometimes the only way to save lives was to risk everything. "All right," Caleb said, reaching for his phone to begin making the calls that would either free them all or destroy everything he had left. "Let's end this." The staged handover took place in the parking lot of the county courthouse, chosen for its public location and the presence of multiple security cameras that would record everything. Caleb had spent the morning contacting every news outlet within 100 miles, spinning a story about a custody dispute involving the presumed dead Ward heirs that was guaranteed to draw media attention. Elena, meanwhile, had used her remaining contacts in the financial world to ensure that federal investigators would be monitoring the situation. The Ward Industries representatives arrived in forced black SUVs with tinted windows, private security contractors who moved with military precision, and at their center, an older man in an expensive suit who Caleb recognized from news photographs as Richard Ward, the corporation's current CEO and Marcus Ward's uncle. The man carried himself with the arrogance of someone who had never been told no, who believed that money and power could solve any problem and silence any inconvenient truth. Max clung to Elena as they approached the predetermined meeting point, his small body trembling with fear, but his eyes showing a new kind of courage that hadn't been there a week ago. Over the past few days, he had begun to trust Caleb in ways that went beyond mere dependency, and that trust had given him strength to face the monsters who had destroyed his family and stolen his childhood. Elena carried with her a briefcase containing 8 years of financial records, communication logs, and documented evidence of the money laundering operation that had led to her husband's murder. Hidden cameras, arranged by Caleb's friend Danny at the sheriff's office, recorded every word and gesture as the corporate delegation attempted to take custody of the boy they believed to be their key to billions in oil revenue. The moment Richard Ward reached for Max, Elena stepped forward and opened her briefcase with theatrical precision. "Before my son goes anywhere," she announced in a voice that carried clearly to every camera and microphone, "I think the public should know why you've spent 6 months trying to kill us." The explosion of activity that followed was controlled chaos orchestrated by careful planning. Richard Ward's security team moved to contain the situation, but found themselves surrounded by county sheriff's deputies who had been positioned throughout the parking lot. Elena's evidence was already being live-streamed to news outlets and federal databases, uploaded through secure connections that Danny had established through his law enforcement networks. As the media swarmed and federal agents arrived to take Richard Ward and his associates into custody, Caleb found himself holding Max while Elena fielded questions from reporters and investigators. The boy's trembling had stopped, replaced by a kind of wonder as he watched the adults who had terrorized him being led away in handcuffs. "Is it over?" Max whispered against Caleb's shoulder. "Yeah, buddy," Caleb replied, surprised by the emotion in his own voice. "It's over." But endings, he was learning, were really just new kinds of beginnings. The legal aftermath moved with surprising speed, driven by media attention and federal prosecutors who smelled career-making headlines. Elena's evidence proved overwhelming, leading to indictments not just of Richard Ward and his immediate conspirators, but of a network of corrupt officials and business partners spanning multiple states. Ward Industries' board of directors was dissolved, its assets frozen pending investigation, and its offshore operations shut down permanently. Elena found herself restored not just to life, but to a position of power she had never asked for and wasn't sure she wanted. As the rightful heir to Marcus Ward's estate and the widow with legal standing to represent Max's interests, she suddenly controlled one of the largest oil fortunes in North America. But power, she discovered, felt different when it came with the responsibility of protecting the people who had saved her life. Her first decision was to establish the Phoenix Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping children who had been victims of family violence and corporate crime. The foundation's headquarters, she announced to a bemused press corps, would be located in a converted garage in a small town that most of them had never heard of, under the operational guidance of a former firefighter who understood better than anyone what it meant to rescue people from impossible situations. Caleb initially resisted her offer to buy the garage, uncomfortable with accepting what felt like charity despite the genuine affection that had grown between them. But Elena's proposal was more complex than simple financial assistance. She wanted to expand the garage into a full automotive training center, a place where young people aging out of foster care could learn trades that would give them independence and purpose. She wanted Max to grow up understanding that wealth meant responsibility, that privilege was only meaningful when it was used to lift others up. "You saved our lives," she told Caleb as they stood in the garage where everything had begun. "Let us help you save other people's lives too." The transition wasn't immediate or easy, requiring patience and understanding from all involved. Max struggled with nightmares and trust issues that would take years to fully heal, requiring therapy and medication, and the kind of consistent love that he had never experienced before his world exploded. Elena battled her own demons, learning to navigate a world where she no longer had to look over her shoulder but still jumped at unexpected sounds and had trouble sleeping through the night. And Caleb faced the challenge of opening his heart again, of allowing himself to care about people who might leave or be taken from him. But slowly, carefully, they built something that none of them had expected: to find a family that chose each other rather than being bound by blood alone. Max began calling Caleb Dad not out of obligation but out of love, the word carrying weight that had nothing to do with legal documents or biological relationships. Josie embraced her role as big sister with the fierce protectiveness she had inherited from her father, becoming Max's defender and guide as he learned to trust the world again. Elena's feelings for Caleb developed with the patient inevitability of sunrise, rooted in gratitude but growing into something deeper and more complex. She had known wealth and privilege her entire life, but had never known the kind of safety that came from being with someone who would walk through fire for the people he loved. Caleb's love, when it finally emerged from behind the walls he had built around his heart, was steady and sure and completely transformative. The wedding took place in the garage on a Tuesday afternoon, with only Danny Rodriguez as witness and a justice of the peace who doubled as the town's mayor. Elena wore a simple white dress from the local department store, and Max carried the rings in a small wooden box that Caleb had made in his workshop. Josie threw flower petals that she had picked from the wild roses growing behind the building, and everyone cried except Max, who grinned with the pure joy of a child who finally understood what security felt like. The Phoenix Foundation grew beyond Elena's original vision, becoming a model for how corporate responsibility could transform entire communities. The Automotive Training Center provided jobs and hope to dozens of young people each year, while the Foundation's counseling services helped families torn apart by violence and exploitation find their way back to each other. But the real measure of their success wasn't in the news articles or the awards that decorated Elena's office. It was in the way Max laughed without looking over his shoulder, in the way Josie had learned that families could grow and change without disappearing, in the way Caleb had rediscovered that saving people was not just his old job but his calling in life. On quiet evenings, when the garage was closed and the training center was empty, the four of them would sit together in the small apartment above the shop, sharing dinner and homework, and the comfortable silence of people who had found their place in the world. The oil company fortune that had once seemed like a curse had become the foundation for something better, not wealth for its own sake, but security that allowed them to focus on what truly mattered. The nightmares still came sometimes, for all of them. Elena would wake from dreams of helicopters and hospital rooms. Max would cry out in his sleep about men in suits who wanted to take him away, and Caleb still occasionally dreamed of fires he couldn't fight. But now they faced those demons together, understanding that healing was not a destination but a journey they could share. The garage itself became a symbol of transformation, its walls bearing both the scars of their ordeal and the signs of their recovery. Elena kept Caleb's old firefighter helmet on a shelf in the office, not as a relic of the past, but as a reminder that heroes were not people who felt no fear, but people who acted despite their fear when others needed saving. The Phoenix Foundation's motto, carved into a wooden sign that hung above the main entrance, captured everything they had learned. We don't just fix what's broken, we build what never existed before. The final test of their new life came not from external threats, but from the simple challenge of believing they deserved the happiness they had found. Elena struggled with survivor's guilt, wondering why she had been spared when Marcus had died. Max worried that his new family might disappear as suddenly as his old one had been destroyed. Josie feared that loving Elena and Max meant betraying the memory of her mother. And Caleb battled the persistent voice that whispered he was not worthy of a second chance at love and fatherhood. But love, they discovered, was not a finite resource that could be depleted by sharing it. Elena's presence in their lives didn't diminish Sarah's memory, but honored it by showing Josie that her father was capable of healing and growth. Max's need for protection and guidance didn't burden Caleb, but reminded him of his own strength and capability. And the family they had built together proved that sometimes the most powerful bonds were those forged not by blood or law, but by choice and commitment and the decision to keep choosing each other every single day. The story might have ended there, with the comfortable resolution of people who had found their place in the world. But life, Elena had learned, was not a story with neat endings, but an ongoing narrative of growth and challenge and unexpected grace. The Phoenix Foundation continued to expand its reach, helping families across the country rebuild their lives after trauma. The garage became a pilgrimage site of sorts for other single parents and survivors of corporate malfeasance, people who had heard their story and needed to see proof that recovery was possible. On the 5th anniversary of the night Elena and Max had first appeared in his garage, Caleb stood in the doorway of their home, watching his family prepare for another ordinary evening. Elena was helping Josie with algebra homework while Max practiced piano in the corner, the notes of a simple melody filling the air with gentle music. The oil fortune had provided security and opportunity, but it was these moments, quiet, unremarkable, and absolutely precious, that had given their lives meaning. A customer's car waited in the garage bay, a routine transmission repair that would be finished tomorrow. The Phoenix Foundation's latest annual report sat on Elena's desk, documenting another year of children helped and families reunited. Max's latest school project, a presentation about heroes, included photographs of firefighters and social workers and ordinary people who chose to help others. And Josie's latest letter to her deceased mother, a tradition Elena had encouraged rather than discouraged, spoke of happiness and safety and the certainty that love could survive even death. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Caleb realized that he had finally learned the difference between surviving and living. Survival was about enduring loss and protecting what remained. Living was about opening your heart to possibility, about choosing hope over fear, about understanding that the best way to honor the people you had lost was to love the people who remained with everything you had. The garage lights came on automatically as darkness fell, illuminating the sign that bore both their names now, Monroe and Ward Automotive and Phoenix Foundation. It was a small business in a small town, serving a community that most of the world would never notice. But it was theirs, built from ashes and sustained by love, proof that sometimes the most powerful transformations happen not in boardrooms or courthouses, but in the quiet spaces where broken people chose to heal together. Elena found him in the doorway, slipping her arms around his waist and leaning against his shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Just this," he replied, gesturing toward the scene in front of them. "All of this. Any regrets?" Caleb considered the question, thinking of the night 5 years ago when two strangers had appeared in his garage and changed everything he thought he knew about family and safety and the possibility of second chances. "No," he said finally. "No regrets at all." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching their children and listening to the sounds of an ordinary evening in an extraordinary life they had built together from nothing more than courage and the determination to protect what mattered most. Outside, the world continued its ancient rhythms of conflict and resolution, loss and recovery, endings and beginnings. But inside their small circle of light and love, they had found something that no corporation could steal and no tragedy could destroy. The simple, revolutionary act of choosing hope over fear every single day for the rest of their lives. The outdoor wedding reception glowed under string lights draped between towering oak trees, the late afternoon sun casting golden shadows across manicured lawns. Crystal glasses caught the light as guests in designer gowns and tailored suits mingled on the terrace, their laughter mixing with the gentle melody of a string quartet. Near a marble column, barely visible among the sea of celebration, sat a 10-year-old girl in an ivory silk dress, her wheelchair positioned where she could see but not be seen. Nobody noticed her watching the dance floor, where her mother smiled and chatted with the city's elite. Then a man in a worn dress shirt paused, looked around, and asked a question that would change 3 lives forever. Why is she alone? The contrast between their worlds had never been sharper than in this moment. Ethan Walsh carried the weight of 38 years in his calloused hands and the lines around his eyes, each mark earned through late nights fixing electrical systems in office buildings across the city. His 8-year-old daughter Lily sat beside him at a corner table, her second-hand party dress carefully pressed, her hair braided with the kind of patience that came from being someone's entire world. They were here because of an old friendship, a college roommate who'd climbed different ladders, but Ethan felt the familiar sting of not quite belonging. He watched Lily's eyes widen at the elaborate ice sculpture, at the servers carrying silver trays, at a world she glimpsed but would never inherit. This was the life he couldn't give her, and the knowledge sat heavy in his chest like stones. Across the reception, Vivienne Roth moved through the crowd with the practiced grace of someone who'd learned to command rooms before she'd learned to command her own heart. At 35, she was everything the business magazines said: brilliant, beautiful, ruthless when necessary. Roth-Tech's quarterly reports spoke of her success in numbers that most people couldn't fathom, but numbers had never explained why she stood alone even in crowds like this. Her daughter Claire had been the center of her universe once, before the accident 4 years ago left them both changed in ways that medical reports couldn't capture. Now Claire sat in her wheelchair, receiving the best care money could buy, but missing something that no amount of wealth could purchase. Vivienne told herself she was protecting her daughter from disappointment, from the world's cruelty, from hope that might be crushed again. But protection, she was learning, could look remarkably like abandonment. The two parents lived their separate struggles in the same city, their children growing up in parallel universes of want and wealth. Ethan's apartment was small but filled with evidence of presence: crayon drawings taped to the refrigerator, a reading corner with mismatched pillows, a jar of coins they saved together for Lily's college fund. He bandaged scraped knees with cartoon bandages, read bedtime stories with different voices for each character, and folded origami cranes from newspaper when Lily needed to make wishes on fallen eyelashes. His love was measured in time given freely, in attention paid without distraction, in the way he listened when she talked about playground politics with the seriousness of international diplomacy. Vivienne's penthouse was a monument to everything Claire might need: physical therapists, private tutors, the latest adaptive technology, a full-time nurse who managed every aspect of her daughter's care with professional efficiency. She provided everything except the one thing she'd forgotten how to give: herself. Since the accident, Vivienne had poured her energy into creating a fortress of security around Claire, hiring experts to handle what she no longer trusted herself to manage. She attended meetings about Claire's progress, signed checks for equipment, and made decisions about her daughter's life from boardrooms and car phones. But she hadn't sat on the floor to play a game, hadn't read a bedtime story, hadn't simply asked about Claire's dreams in so long that she'd forgotten what her daughter's natural laugh sounded like. The moment Ethan noticed Claire was the moment everything shifted, though none of them understood it yet. He saw what everyone else had learned to look past, a child sitting alone while adults celebrated love and family around her. He saw the careful way she held her hands folded in her lap, the practiced stillness of someone who'd learned not to draw attention to her needs. When he approached, Claire looked up with the startled expression of someone unaccustomed to being seen. Her face had the pale quality of too much time spent indoors, but her eyes held the bright intelligence that no accident could dim. She was beautiful in the way that children are beautiful when they're trying very hard to be invisible, and Ethan's heart broke a little for all the ways the world had taught her to shrink. "Hi there," he said, crouching down to her eye level. "I'm Ethan. That's my daughter Lily over there, the one with the braids." Claire followed his gaze to where Lily was carefully folding her napkin into what might become a flower. "She's shy too, but she makes friends with origami. Would you like to meet her?" Claire nodded, and for the first time all evening, someone asked what she wanted instead of what she needed. When Ethan wheeled her chair toward their table, positioning her where she could see everything, Claire smiled with the rusty quality of something that hadn't been used in too long. Lily looked up from her paper flower and immediately began teaching Claire the folds, their heads bent together over the makeshift craft project, two children finding each other across the vast divide of their different worlds. The scene might have been perfect in its simplicity, but perfection rarely survives contact with reality. A cluster of wedding guests noticed the unusual tableau, the working-class man, his modestly dressed daughter, and the CEO's disabled child sharing what looked dangerously like joy. Their whispers carried the sharp edge of social boundaries being crossed, of protocols being violated. A woman in pearls and practiced disapproval approached, her smile tight with the kind of concern that felt more like control. "Excuse me," she said to Ethan, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "but this really isn't appropriate. That's Miss Roth's daughter, and she has specific care requirements. I don't think you understand the situation." Her words were polite, but her meaning was clear. People like you don't belong here, especially not with children like her. Ethan felt the familiar burn of being dismissed, of having his worth measured by his bank account or his zip code. But Claire was watching, and Lily was listening, and sometimes the most important battles are fought not for ourselves, but for the children who need to see that kindness doesn't require permission. "I understand that she's a little girl who was sitting alone at a party," he replied quietly, his voice steady despite the anger building in his chest. "I understand that she smiled when someone paid attention to her. And I understand that treating children like they're fragile is different from treating them like they're invisible." The woman's face flushed, and other guests began to turn, drawn by the tension in voices that were trying to remain civil. Claire had gone very still, the way children do when adults fight about them instead of with them, and Ethan realized that his defense of her was about to become another burden she'd have to carry. That's when Vivienne appeared, drawn by the commotion and the sight of her daughter surrounded by strangers. She moved through the crowd with the swift efficiency of someone accustomed to managing crises, her heels clicking against the stone terrace like a countdown. When she saw Claire at the table with Ethan and Lily, saw the paper flowers scattered between them, saw her daughter's face bright with something that looked dangerously like happiness, Vivienne felt a complex mix of relief and panic. Relief that Claire was safe, engaged, smiling, panic that a stranger had accomplished in minutes, what she hadn't managed in months. But panic won, the way it always did when she felt her control slipping, and she reverted to the persona that had carried her through boardroom battles and hostile takeovers. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice carrying the polite ice that could freeze conversations across conference tables. "But I need to take Claire now. She has a schedule, and this wasn't part of it." She moved to position herself behind Claire's wheelchair, her hands gripping the handles with more force than necessary. Ethan stood slowly, and Vivienne found herself looking up at him, taking in the worn edges of his clothes, the paint under his fingernails, the way he held himself like someone who'd learned not to expect much from people like her. She made a calculation based on appearance, on assumptions that felt safer than curiosity, and delivered the words that would haunt her for months. "My daughter doesn't need your pity, and she doesn't need a handyman lecturing me about parenting." The silence that followed was the kind that draws blood. Lily's face crumpled with the particular devastation of children who've watched their parent be publicly humiliated. Claire's smile died so completely it was like watching a light switch be turned off. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond with anger. Instead, he crouched down one more time, looked directly at Claire, and said, "It was really nice meeting you. Thank you for teaching me about paper flowers." Then he took Lily's hand and walked away, leaving Vivienne standing with her daughter in a circle of watching eyes and heavy silence. But Claire was watching Ethan leave with an expression that Vivienne had never seen before, the look of someone who'd been given a gift and then watched it be taken away. It was the look of a child who'd remembered what it felt like to be just a child. Not a medical case or a source of worry or a symbol of tragedy, but simply a person worth talking to. And Vivienne, for all her success in reading people and situations, couldn't decode the devastation in her daughter's eyes or understand why her own chest felt tight with something that might have been shame. The days that followed the wedding were marked by a silence that felt different from their usual quiet. Claire, who had grown accustomed to the routines of physical therapy and tutoring sessions, now moved through her schedule with a listlessness that worried her medical team. She ate less, spoke even less, and spent hours staring out her bedroom window at the city beyond. When her nurse asked what was wrong, Claire simply shook her head. When her tutor tried to engage her in lessons, she participated with mechanical precision but no enthusiasm. It was as if something vital had been awakened at the wedding and then immediately extinguished, leaving her more aware of what was missing. Vivienne threw herself into work with renewed intensity, as if quarterly reports and acquisition deals could somehow balance the equation she couldn't solve at home. But concentration proved elusive when she kept remembering the sound of Claire's laugh, brief as it had been, genuine in a way she hadn't heard since before the accident. She found herself checking the security footage from the wedding, watching the moments when Claire's face had come alive while folding paper with Lily, seeing her daughter become animated in a way that no amount of expensive therapy had achieved. The footage was damning in its simplicity. It showed a child who'd been starving for ordinary human connection, and a mother who'd been too afraid to provide it. Late one night, unable to sleep, Vivienne stood outside Claire's bedroom door and heard her daughter talking quietly to her night nurse. "He saw me," Claire was saying, her voice carrying the weight of revelation. "Not my wheelchair, not my problems, just me. And he asked what I wanted, not what I needed." The nurse made sympathetic sounds, but Claire continued, "Mom never asks what I want anymore. She just makes sure I have everything I'm supposed to have. But I don't know what I want because nobody ever asks." Vivienne pressed her back against the hallway wall, her hand over her mouth to keep from making a sound. The truth of her daughter's words hit her like a physical blow. She had become so focused on managing Claire's disability that she'd forgotten to nurture Claire's humanity. The realization that followed was both devastating and clarifying. Vivienne had spent 4 years building walls between herself and her daughter's pain, believing that professional distance would somehow protect them both. She'd hired others to provide comfort because she was terrified of failing, of saying the wrong thing, of not being enough. But in her effort to shield Claire from disappointment, she'd withheld the one thing no expert could provide, a mother's imperfect, unconditional presence. She'd been running a corporation's worth of people to care for one small girl, when what Claire needed was for her mother to simply show up, sit down, and stay. That night, Vivienne made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. She would find Ethan Walsh, not to defend her actions or explain her circumstances, but to understand what he'd seen in Claire that she'd been missing. She would swallow her pride, admit her failures, and ask for help not as a CEO accustomed to purchasing solutions, but as a mother who'd lost her way. It would mean acknowledging that love wasn't always about providing the best of everything, but sometimes about being willing to provide the most important thing, yourself, flawed and frightened and present. The next morning dawned gray and uncertain, matching the weather in Vivienne's chest as she drove through parts of the city she'd only seen from highway overpasses. The GPS led her through neighborhoods where houses sat close together, where children's bicycles leaned against chain-link fences, where laundry hung on lines instead of disappearing into machines operated by housekeeping staff. She felt like an alien in her luxury sedan, conscious of how her clothes, her car, her entire presentation marked her as an outsider. But she kept driving because turning back would mean accepting that the gulf between their worlds was unbridgeable, and Claire's future happiness might depend on proving that assumption wrong. Ethan's building was a 3-story brick structure with flower boxes in some windows and a playground across the street where children played while their parents watched from benches. Vivienne sat in her car for several minutes, rehearsing what she might say, before realizing that this wasn't a business meeting that could be scripted and controlled. She was about to ask a stranger to help her learn how to be a mother to her own child, and no amount of preparation could make that conversation easy. When she finally knocked on apartment 2B, she heard footsteps and children's voices, and then Ethan opened the door with the expression of someone who'd been expecting anyone but her. "Miss Roth," he said, and his voice was carefully neutral, giving nothing away. Behind him, she could see a small apartment that looked lived in rather than decorated, comfortable rather than impressive. Lily appeared at his elbow, curious and cautious, her eyes wide at seeing the elegant woman from the wedding standing in their doorway. Vivienne had prepared several opening lines, professional approaches to what felt like a negotiation, but what came out was simpler and more honest than anything she'd planned. "I'm not here to fix anything. I'm here to start over." Ethan studied her face for a long moment, seeing something there that made him step aside and gesture toward their small kitchen table. As Vivienne sat down, she noticed details that spoke of a life lived with attention. Drawings held to the refrigerator with magnets, a half-finished jigsaw puzzle on a side table, books with cracked spines that had clearly been read multiple times. This was what a home looked like when someone was actually living in it, rather than just maintaining it. Lily hovered nearby, torn between curiosity and the protective instincts children develop when they sense their parent has been hurt. "Claire hasn't spoken since the wedding," Vivienne began, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly around the coffee mug Ethan had offered. "I mean, she answers questions, follows instructions, participates in her therapies. But she's not really there anymore. And I realize that I don't know how to reach her because I've been so busy protecting her that I forgot how to connect with her." She looked up at Ethan, her composure cracking slightly. "I don't know what you did in those few minutes, but you reminded her of something I made her forget, and I need to understand what that was." Ethan sat across from her, and his response surprised her with its gentleness rather than accusation. "I didn't do anything special," he said. "I just treated her like a person instead of a condition. I asked what she wanted instead of what she needed. I assumed she had opinions and preferences and the right to make choices about small things, like whether she wanted to learn origami." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Claire isn't fragile because she uses a wheelchair. She's lonely because she's been isolated from ordinary experiences in the name of keeping her safe." The conversation that followed lasted 3 hours and changed both of their lives. Vivienne found herself telling Ethan about the accident, about the guilt that had driven her to hire teams of experts rather than trust her own instincts, about the fear that she wasn't enough to help her daughter heal. Ethan shared his own struggles with single parenthood, with the weight of being someone's entire world, with the daily balance between protection and independence that every parent had to navigate. They discovered that despite their different circumstances, they were both wrestling with the same fundamental question: how do you love someone enough to let them risk being hurt? When Vivienne finally asked if he and Lily would consider joining her and Claire for dinner, it wasn't as CEO of Rothtech making a business proposition. It was as a mother admitting she needed help learning how to be present in her own daughter's life. Ethan's yes was equally simple, offered not because he was impressed by her wealth or status, but because he'd seen Claire's face at the wedding and understood that some children's happiness was worth crossing social boundaries to protect. The Saturday dinners that followed became an experiment in creating family from unexpected pieces. Vivienne's penthouse, usually sterile in its perfection, gradually came alive with the chaos of actual living. Claire began speaking more, asking questions, expressing preferences about food and activities and how she wanted to spend her time. She taught Lily about the adaptive technologies she used, while Lily taught Claire card games and showed her how to braid friendship bracelets. The two girls created elaborate imaginary worlds during their play, stories where differences were adventures rather than limitations. The adults learned to navigate their own growing connection with careful attention to their daughter's needs. Vivienne discovered that she enjoyed cooking when it meant creating something together rather than simply providing nutrition. She and Lily spent one memorable afternoon attempting to bake cookies, resulting in a kitchen disaster that left them both covered in flour and laughing helplessly. Ethan found himself becoming Claire's unofficial consultant on accessibility improvements around the penthouse. Small modifications that increased her independence while teaching Vivienne to see her environment through her daughter's eyes. More importantly, Vivienne began learning how to be present without an agenda. She sat with Claire during afternoon rest periods, not to monitor her condition, but simply to be available if conversation arose. She discovered that her daughter had opinions about books, preferences about music, and dreams about travel that had nothing to do with medical considerations. Claire wanted to see the ocean, learn to paint watercolors, and maybe get a dog someday. These were ordinary childhood desires that had been buried under layers of therapeutic objectives and safety protocols. One evening, while the girls worked on a puzzle in the living room, Claire accidentally knocked over a glass of water. Vivienne's first instinct was to call for towels, to manage the situation efficiently, but Claire's expression stopped her. Her daughter was waiting for the familiar pattern, the rush to clean up, the gentle scolding disguised as concern, the reminder to be more careful. Instead, Vivienne simply handed Claire some napkins and said, "Happens to everyone. The puzzle pieces will dry." It was a small moment, but Claire's smile suggested it felt revolutionary. The friendship between Lily and Claire deepened in ways that surprised all the adults. Lily, who had always been somewhat shy and careful, became more confident in her role as Claire's friend and occasional advocate. When they visited the park and other children stared at Claire's wheelchair, Lily simply introduced her friend and invited others to join their games. Claire, who had grown accustomed to being treated as fragile, began asserting herself more, asking to try new activities and expressing frustration when adults made decisions based on assumptions rather than her actual capabilities. They developed rituals that belonged to them alone. Saturday morning pancakes where everyone contributed one ingredient, evening walks around the neighborhood where Claire could practice navigating different terrains, and Sunday afternoon art projects that resulted in masterpieces worthy of refrigerator display. Vivienne found herself looking forward to these times with an anticipation she hadn't felt since before the accident, when Claire's laughter had been the soundtrack to her happiness. The crisis that tested their newfound equilibrium came on a sunny Tuesday afternoon in the park. Claire had been working with her physical therapist on transferring from her wheelchair to park benches, building strength and confidence in her mobility. She'd been making excellent progress, and when she saw a paper airplane caught in a low tree branch, she decided to attempt the transfer on her own. The bench was slightly higher than the ones she'd practiced with, and when she reached for the airplane, she lost her balance and fell to the ground. The fall itself wasn't serious, resulting in scraped palms and wounded pride rather than actual injury. But Claire's reaction was immediate and intense. She wanted her mother, not her therapist, not the concerned strangers who gathered to help, not even Ethan, who had rushed over from across the playground. She wanted Vivienne, who was 50 yards away taking a business call that had seemed important until she heard her daughter calling for her. The sound cut through every other priority, and Vivienne found herself dropping her phone and running in a way she hadn't run since childhood, her heels discarded somewhere between the bench and her daughter's side. When she reached Claire, Vivienne didn't assess the damage or ask medical questions or call for professional assistance. She simply dropped to her knees on the playground mulch, gathered her daughter into her arms, and held her while Claire cried against her shoulder. "I'm here," Vivienne whispered, rocking slightly. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Claire's tears weren't really about the fall. They were about months of stored-up fear and loneliness, and the relief of finally having her mother catch her when she fell, literally and figuratively. The incident marked a turning point in their relationship. Claire began taking more risks, knowing that her mother would be there to help her handle the consequences, rather than prevent all possibility of failure. Vivienne began trusting her instincts more, understanding that love sometimes meant allowing controlled dangers in service of growth and independence. She took a leave of absence from Rothtech, the first vacation she'd taken since Claire's accident, to focus on learning how to be present in her daughter's daily life. During these weeks together, Vivienne discovered aspects of motherhood she'd forgotten she enjoyed. She learned Claire's preferences for bedtime stories, her theories about why clouds moved, her detailed plans for the treehouse she wanted to build someday. They developed inside jokes and secret traditions, the small intimacies that make families feel like home to each other. Claire began laughing more frequently, the rusty quality replaced by something bright and genuine and utterly her own. Ethan watched this transformation with the satisfaction of someone who'd helped heal something that needed healing. His own relationship with Lily deepened as well, as she gained confidence from her friendship with Claire and from seeing how adults could model healthy relationships across difference. The four of them had become something unprecedented in all their lives. A chosen family that worked not because it fit conventional definitions, but because it met everyone's needs for connection, growth, and belonging. When Claire asked if she could try attending regular school 1 day per week, Vivienne's first impulse was to catalog all the potential problems and complications. But Claire's expression was so hopeful, and her reasons so sound, that Vivienne found herself saying yes before her fears could construct objections. The trial run was successful enough to expand to 2 days, then 3, with Claire navigating both the social and academic challenges with increasing confidence. She made friends who saw her wheelchair as simply one characteristic among many, no more defining than hair color or favorite subject. 1 year after the wedding that had brought them together, they found themselves at another celebration, the marriage of Vivienne's business partner, someone who had watched the transformation in both Vivienne and Claire with amazement and approval. This time, there was no question of anyone sitting alone or being overlooked. Claire and Lily had appointed themselves as unofficial wedding coordinators for younger guests, organizing games and activities that included everyone regardless of their abilities or circumstances. When the band began playing for dancing, Claire surprised everyone by wheeling herself to the center of the floor and beckoning for Lily to join her. The other guests paused to watch as the two girls began moving to the music, Claire's chair spinning and gliding while Lily danced beside her, their movements synchronized by friendship rather than choreography. Other children joined them, then adults, until the dance floor filled with people moving together in celebration. Ethan approached Vivienne, who was watching from the sidelines with tears in her eyes. "Care to dance?" he asked, offering his hand. As they moved together, Vivienne realized that this was what healing looked like, not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of people willing to face difficulties together. Claire caught her eye from the dance floor and grinned, her happiness so radiant that several guests turned to see what was lighting up the room. "Mr. Ethan," Claire called over the music, "you forgot your part." She gestured for him to join their small circle, and then looked expectantly at her mother. Vivienne stepped forward without hesitation, taking her place in the group as they swayed together to the slow song that had just begun. 4 people who had found each other across the vast spaces of difference and circumstance, creating something that looked nothing like conventional family but felt exactly like home. As the music played, Vivienne thought about the question that had started it all. Why is she alone? The answer had turned out to be more complex than anyone had imagined, involving not just Claire's isolation, but the isolation that all of them had experienced in different ways. Ethan had been alone with the weight of single parenthood and economic insecurity. Lily had been alone with her natural shyness and limited social opportunities. Vivienne had been alone with her guilt and fear of failing her daughter again. And Claire had been alone with her needs in a world that preferred to meet them from a professional distance. But they weren't alone anymore. They had created something new, a family defined not by blood or law, but by choice, commitment, and the daily decision to show up for each other's joys and struggles. Claire was still disabled, but she was no longer defined by her disability. Vivienne was still a successful businesswoman, but she was no longer hiding behind her success. Ethan was still working class, but he was no longer apologizing for his circumstances. Lily was still sometimes shy, but she was no longer shrinking from new experiences. The song ended, and the dance floor began to fill with other couples, but the 4 of them remained in their small circle for a moment longer. Claire reached up to take her mother's hand, Lily grabbed Ethan's, and they stood together in the middle of the celebration, surrounded by music and laughter and the warm glow of string lights, no longer asking why anyone should be alone, because they had found the answer in each other. Some families are born, others are made, and the very best ones are chosen daily through small acts of love and larger acts of courage, by people brave enough to see past surface differences to the fundamental human need for connection, belonging, and the simple recognition that everyone deserves to be seen, valued, and included in the dance.